He left me at the altar, then demanded I refund his family for their wasted travel. 10 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, I realized my fiancé was missing. At first, I thought I must be losing my mind. It was my wedding day, after all, and nerves do weird things to you. But I kept glancing at my phone, which hadn't shown a single new message since last night. My friends were running around, fussing over my dress and makeup, blissfully unaware that my heart was hammering so loud I thought they could hear it. One of them asked if I needed more lip gloss, and I almost screamed, "Forget the lip gloss, where is Daniel?" But I stayed quiet because I didn't want to stir panic. I wanted to believe he might walk through the door at any second with some ridiculous excuse, like I had to drive back to my apartment to grab the ring. Unfortunately, that fantasy was about to be obliterated, along with any illusions I'd had about the man I thought I knew inside and out. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, raised by two loving but very practical parents. My dad's an accountant, my mom's a high school librarian, and for them, stable income and a quiet life were the ultimate goals. They always laughed about how I was more of a dreamer than both of them combined. Right after high school, I moved to Chicago for college, determined to build a bright future for myself in marketing and PR. That's where I met Daniel. He was in grad school for computer science, the quintessential tech whiz who coded with one hand and scrolled through job offers with the other. I was drawn to him instantly. He was funny in a sarcastic, dry sort of way, which matched my own sense of humor, and he had an easiness about him that put me at peace. We ended up bonding over late-night group study sessions, commiserating about deadlines and professors who seemed to grade like they had a personal vendetta. Our first official date was cheap pizza and a midnight walk along the lake, stealing bites of each other's slices while he told me about the startup ideas he had. He seemed to love my ambition just as much as I loved his. By the time we graduated, he already had a decent job lined up at a tech company in the city, and I scored an entry-level gig at a PR agency. We moved in together, into a one-bedroom apartment with questionable plumbing, but it was ours and we were happy. It wasn't all roses. We had the normal fights any young couple has: money, dividing up chores, whose turn it was to buy groceries. But whenever we argued, Daniel could always make me laugh. He'd crack a joke and soon I'd forget what we were even mad about. Things started feeling more and more real once we both settled into our careers. I jumped jobs a few times to move up the ladder in PR while he kept getting promotions. About 3 years into dating, he proposed. It happened in the simplest way imaginable. We were in our living room eating takeout and he just said, "So, I've been thinking, but I don't ever want to be without you. Will you marry me?" He didn't even have a ring at that moment. He just blurted it out. My answer was a no-brainer. We hugged, I cried, and for a while everything felt absolutely perfect. We told our families the next day. My parents were over the moon for me. They'd always liked Daniel and considered him a grounded, responsible guy, which was exactly what they hoped I'd find. His parents, Ted and Janice, lived out west in Oregon. Over a video call, they congratulated us, though Janice immediately started hinting at how big or fancy the wedding ought to be. I brushed it off, thinking, she's just excited for her only son. If I could go back in time, I'd pay more attention to the way she pushed her opinions. But hey, love is blind, or at least short-sighted. The initial plan was a small ceremony in Chicago with maybe 50 people, just close friends and family. But that plan mutated overnight as soon as Janice jumped on board. She wanted a grand affair. She insisted we consider booking a sprawling lodge near a vineyard her friends had once used for a lavish reception. She told us we could invite people from out of state, out of the country even. Daniel got that uneasy look, the one that said, "This might be more than we can handle." But then Janice offered to cover a significant chunk of the expenses. My parents, not wealthy by any stretch, were relieved they wouldn't be forced to chip in beyond their means. So, I tried to be agreeable. When Daniel and I flew to Oregon to do a venue tour, my gut twisted. The place was all polished wood floors, massive chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking rolling hills. Gorgeous, yes, but it was triple what we planned on spending. Janice waved it off with a breezy, "Don't worry about the cost, dear. We can handle that. Let's just give you two the wedding of your dreams." Except it wasn't really my dream. I'd have been content with a backyard wedding and a good DJ, but I kept telling myself, it's just one day. If it makes them happy, so be it. Daniel, for his part, mostly stood on the sidelines, letting his mother push her agenda. That started bugging me. He never openly disagreed with her in front of me, but I could sense he felt overshadowed. When I asked him privately if he really wanted all this extravagance, he'd shrug and say, "I don't care about the fancy details, but Mom's excited, and she's paying for a lot." I tried not to feel frustrated. Maybe he was right, and we should just let her go nuts. My parents, on the other hand, were relieved they wouldn't have to host in Ohio or foot some huge bill. They told me, as long as you're happy, we're happy. So it all seemed like a done deal. We began planning in earnest. Janice and I talked almost daily. She had me picking out flower arrangements, discussing which linens to match with which centerpiece, how to seat everyone for maximum elegance. At first, I appreciated her involvement. As stressful as wedding planning can be, she made me feel like I wasn't alone. But over the months, it started to feel like she was dictating the entire event. If I expressed a different opinion, she'd talk over me. She'd say, "Claire, trust me. I've helped plan so many events. It'll look tacky if we do that." The sneering tone of tacky always hit a nerve. I'd call Daniel, telling him how stifled I felt. But he'd just go, "Mom knows best," or "She's paying for it, so it's kind of her call." I swallowed my irritation because I loved Daniel and convinced myself that after the wedding was over, we'd be free to live our lives as we chose. As the big day got closer, Daniel's tension became more obvious. He'd snap at me about small things, like if I asked him to confirm the DJ's contract. He'd apologize afterward, but he rarely talked about what was really eating him up. A week before the wedding, we had a minor argument about the seating chart, because it was turning into a monstrous puzzle thanks to Janice wanting her business associates seated together. Daniel just lost it, yelling something like, "I don't care about this stupid chart," and storming off. I remember sitting there, stunned. I began to wonder if we should have just eloped. But then I reminded myself we'd gone too far down this path, and I told him as much, saying, "Let's just get through the day." He muttered something like, "Yeah, sure," and we tried to move on. Still, it left me with a pit in my stomach. The day before the wedding, I arrived at the lodge with my maid of honor and bridesmaids. We had a suite on the top floor overlooking those endless vineyards. People were arriving left and right. Our friends from Chicago, my relatives from Ohio, and some of Daniel's extended family from New York, even a few from overseas. The place was bustling. Janice popped in a few times, insisting I try some special face serum or reminding me about the rehearsal dinner schedule. Oddly enough, I barely saw Daniel. He was staying in a separate suite with his dad and a couple of groomsmen. He texted me, "Love you, see you tomorrow," at around 10 p. Milli Mazrinia. And that was the last I heard from him. Fast forward to the wedding morning. I woke up early with a strange sense of dread, but I convinced myself it was just typical wedding jitters. My bridesmaids were so sweet, making sure I had coffee, double-checking my gown, organizing last-minute details with the venue staff. Around 8, I tried calling Daniel just to say hi. No answer. I figured maybe he was dealing with his own chaos or sleeping in. At 9, I texted him again. Still nothing. By 10, I was on the verge of panic. That's when I started telling my closest friend, "Can you try calling Daniel's best man? This is weird." The best man didn't pick up either. Everyone tried to reassure me that men can be scatterbrained on wedding mornings, maybe heading out for a hair trim or last-minute errands. But by 11, word got out that Daniel was nowhere to be found. It was as if he'd vanished. His father, Ted, was pacing the hallway, calling every contact on Daniel's phone. I overheard Janice on the phone with one of Daniel's friends, her voice shaking. The ceremony was supposed to start at noon, and we had about 100 guests milling around. My father found me hidden in a corner of the lodge and asked gently, "Honey, have you heard from him yet?" I just shook my head, tears threatening to spill. I refused to let myself cry, thinking, he'll show up. He has to. Mace. The clock struck noon. The officiant was in position. The music began. That soft classical piece I'd chosen months ago. My bridesmaids lined up, giving me worried glances. I stood there in my long white gown, trying not to hyperventilate. My mother whispered, "Claire, do we delay? What do we do?" I looked around, saw the guests standing expectantly. The sun was pouring in through the tall windows, turning the moment into some surreal painting. Except the groom was missing. I waited 5 more minutes, my heart racing, my palms sweaty. Another 5 minutes of excruciating stillness followed. Finally, I couldn't stand it. I quietly walked up to the officiant and asked him to announce a delay. People began murmuring. Some looked at me with pity, some were just confused. We waited and waited, but after nearly 40 minutes it was clear Daniel wasn't walking through those doors. No one had been able to reach him. He wasn't in his suite, wasn't at his parents' house. The best man claimed he had no clue where Daniel was. My chest felt so tight I thought I'd pass out. I asked the officiant to formally announce that the ceremony was canceled. I remember him clearing his throat, looking pained, telling everyone, "I'm sorry, folks, but there's been a change of plans." That was the moment I lost it. My eyes blurred with tears and my legs almost gave out beneath me. My father led me out of the main hall and the questions started. Is everything all right? Did Daniel have an emergency? But I had no answers. All I knew was that my wedding day had turned into a humiliating fiasco. Eventually, the guests began to file out. Some lingered, hoping for an explanation. My mother tried to handle the logistical side. She spoke with the staff, arranged for leftover food to be donated or packed up, paid the final bills. I changed out of my dress, every movement feeling like I was in a nightmare. My bridesmaids tried to comfort me, but there were no words for that kind of shock. I just kept muttering, I can't believe this is happening. That evening, we still didn't hear from Daniel. I was so distraught I barely moved from the bed in the suite. My dad suggested we call the police and report him missing. For all we knew, something terrible might have happened. We made the report, gave them the details. However, part of me began to suspect this was no accident. After everyone left, I went back to my apartment in Chicago. My mother stayed with me, quietly making tea I couldn't drink. I stared at the wall until dawn broke, refusing to cry anymore because I had no tears left. It wasn't until 2 days later, 2 days of radio silence, that Daniel finally texted me. A single line, "Claire, I'm so sorry." I panicked. "I'll explain when I'm ready." I dropped my phone, my hands shaking. That was it? After abandoning me in front of everyone, that was all he had to say? My father asked me what the message said, and I told him. He swore under his breath, something he rarely does. My mother urged me to block Daniel's number, but I couldn't. I needed an explanation. So I waited, and a few hours later, Daniel asked if we could meet at a cafe near his office. Against my better judgment, I agreed. He looked disheveled when he walked in, and I was sitting there in my sneakers and sweatpants, too mentally drained to care about appearances. He didn't even order coffee. He just sat down and said, "Claire, I'm sorry I disappeared. I just couldn't go through with it." My mom was pushing this huge wedding, and I felt like I couldn't handle everyone's expectations. I got overwhelmed. I remember staring at him, my heart pounding with rage, sorrow, confusion, everything at once. "So you left me there alone?" I asked. He kept apologizing, repeating how he felt trapped. It felt surreal to hear him say he was scared of letting people down. So instead, he did exactly that in the worst possible way. I asked him if it was about me, if he didn't love me anymore. He shook his head, insisted he still loved me, that it was the pressure of the whole event that caused his meltdown. He mentioned feeling like we should have had a smaller wedding, or even just eloped, and he was kicking himself for not voicing it sooner. I was numb, unable to decide if I believed him. If he truly loved me, why not say something? Why not warn me, or at least have the guts to tell me he couldn't do it before we got to the altar? By the end of that conversation, I left without any real resolution, just a sad acceptance that everything I'd built up in my head had come crashing down. A week after that, while I was still in the throes of heartbreak, Daniel hit me with a text that nearly made me throw my phone across the room. He said his family, and especially his mother, were furious about all the relatives and friends who traveled long distances for the wedding. They were blaming me for not stopping the wedding if I knew he was so anxious. He wrote, "Mom thinks you should split the cost of their wasted travel and hotel expenses because everyone lost money on this." I remember literally laughing, a bitter, angry laugh because it was so twisted. I told him in no uncertain terms that was never going to happen. I pointed out that my own family had also spent money on hotels and travel, that I'd been left standing at the altar. If anyone deserved compensation, it was me. But he insisted they were serious. I told him his family could do whatever they wanted. They weren't getting a dime from me. A few days later, Janice called. She demanded I meet her at some upscale restaurant. Stupidly, I went, thinking maybe I could talk sense into her. She wasted no time blaming me for Daniel's meltdown, implying I should have seen the signs, and canceled everything before it got to that point. She said her friends and relatives flew in from out of state, some from abroad, and that they'd spent a fortune on airfare, hotels, gifts, all for a wedding that was destroyed by me. I asked her how exactly I destroyed it when Daniel was the one who ran off. She gave me this cold, pitying look and said, "If you had been a proper partner, he wouldn't have cracked under pressure." Then she slid a handwritten list across the table, names of family members and the amounts they supposedly spent. I couldn't believe the nerve. She literally wanted me to reimburse them. I told her no, stood up and walked out. She yelled after me that I'd regret it, that they'd take action if I refused. I hated how my body trembled with fear and anger as I left, but I was determined not to cave. Soon, people I knew started hearing rumors that I was the controlling fiancé, that I insisted on a grand wedding to impress everyone, so Daniel ran. It was insane. Anyone close to me knew I never wanted that big fancy venue in the first place. But you can't control gossip, and Janice was clearly spinning the story her way. For a while, I sank into a depressive fog, barely getting out of bed. My boss at the PR agency let me take some personal leave, saying kindly, "Get some rest. Sort out whatever you need to." My parents were wonderful, letting me stay with them a while, reassuring me that I'd done nothing wrong. Daniel tried reaching out again a few weeks later. He apologized for his mother's behavior, said he couldn't control her. He insisted he still wanted to be with me, that we could try again with a smaller ceremony in the future if I'd just forgive him. Part of me wanted to hold on to that fantasy that we could fix it, but my anger and pain were too great. I remembered standing there in a white dress, trembling because I realized he was gone. I couldn't just erase that. We met in a park, and for the first time I felt no warmth toward him, only pity and a deep sense of betrayal. He gave this teary-eyed speech about being a coward, about how he'd always regret hurting me. But it was too late. I told him I couldn't trust him anymore. My heart felt like a stone. He left, shoulders slumped, looking more lost than ever, and that was the last time we met in person. In the weeks and months that followed, I had to figure out who I was without Daniel. I moved out of the apartment we'd shared. He'd already taken most of his things, and found a smaller place of my own. It was lonely, sure, but also peaceful. My parents visited often to check on me, helping me get used to my new normal. Meanwhile, Janice continued her crusade, telling random people that I owed them for ruining the wedding. A friend suggested I consult a lawyer just to be safe. I did, and he told me they had zero legal ground to stand on. At most, they could create a social media scandal, but they couldn't force me to pay anything. That gave me some relief. I never heard about any actual lawsuit, so I suspect they were just bluffing. Honestly, the hardest part was learning how to handle the shame. There's a unique kind of humiliation in being left at the altar. People respond with pity, or worse, with curiosity, as if it's a juicy piece of gossip. I went offline for a while to avoid the swirling rumors. My therapist encouraged me to write about the experience, to get the thoughts out of my head and onto paper. It helped. I started journaling everything. The way I felt that morning, the exact moment I realized he was gone, the texts he sent, the heartbreak, all of it. And over time, I found my perspective shifting. I started to see it as him doing me a favor by showing me who he really was before we said I do. If he couldn't stand up for what he wanted, if he couldn't communicate his fears, if he could ditch me at the last second rather than simply be honest, that was not someone I wanted to spend my life with, regardless of how many wonderful moments we'd had before. Eventually, I returned to work, found my footing again, and rediscovered parts of myself I'd neglected. I hung out with my friends, some of whom I'd barely seen in the chaos leading up to the wedding. I took a weekend trip to a cabin in Wisconsin to clear my head. I started letting myself dream again, about a future that didn't include Daniel. And I realized, surprisingly, that I felt lighter. Sure, I cried sometimes, but it wasn't because I missed him so much as because the betrayal still stung. People ask me if I ever want to get married after going through that trauma. I tell them I do. But next time, I'll pay attention to the red flags. I won't let future in-laws bulldoze me, and I won't ignore it if my partner seems terrified and shuts down instead of talking. Love is amazing, but it can't fix fundamental communication issues or a lack of courage. As for Daniel, I have no idea where life took him. I assume he eventually crawled back to Oregon or stayed in Chicago. We haven't spoken in ages. Now and then, I wonder if he ever told his family the truth. That the only reason their flights and hotels were wasted is because he ran off. It doesn't matter. I've rebuilt my life, even if it meant starting from scratch. The strangest part of this whole story might be that, in a twisted way, I'm grateful he left when he did. If he'd forced himself to go through with the vows, we'd probably be divorced by now. We'd be tangled in more complicated knots of resentment. At least this way, I could walk away without being legally bound to him. So yes, I got humiliated in front of a crowd of people I loved. But that humiliation ended up setting me free from a marriage that would have been doomed. That's what I hold on to whenever a friend or colleague says something like, "Wow, that must have been the worst day of your life." It was, but it was also the day I escaped a much bigger disaster. So that's how I ended up standing alone at my own wedding. And that's how Daniel's family had the gall to demand I reimburse them for their wasted travel. Sometimes I still shake my head in disbelief, but life goes on. I'm still working in PR, hopefully moving up in my career, and I've even started dating again. Slowly, cautiously. I'm no longer the naive girl who will shrug off her own needs just to accommodate someone else's plan. I'm stronger now. And if any good came out of this, it's that I learned how to spot when someone is shutting down emotionally instead of leaning on me for support. I refuse to live in a relationship built on silent anxieties and unspoken resentments. That's it. That's my story. I was left at the altar, literally left there while a room full of people waited, and then bombarded with absurd requests for reimbursement. It still sounds like a melodramatic movie script when I say it out loud. But it happened, and I survived. I got stronger, found independence, and gained a sharper sense of my own worth. If anyone reading this has gone through something similar, or is heading down a path with endless red flags, just know you're not alone, and you deserve better. No one should settle for a partner who can't talk about real issues before they blow up into a humiliating spectacle. Trust me, it's not worth the fancy venue or the big party or anyone's approval. You deserve a partner who will stand by you no matter how overwhelming the world feels. And if they can't, well, it's best to find out sooner rather than later.